Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The last of the daylight faded behind the ridge in a slow, uneven crawl as Elias Ward stepped onto his porch with the kind of tension that came from 2 nights of unanswered questions. His dog had slipped into the dark again, same as before, leaving without a sound. Elias didn't call after it, because calling never worked, and because a man who spent years alone learned not to expect quick answers from anything that lived out here. Still, each time the animal vanished, a tight feeling settled in his stomach, something close to worry even though he tried to ignore it. He stood there for a while, letting the cold settle into his coat as he watched the yard. The ground near the fence was dry, the pine shadows long and motionless. He listened for footsteps or distant howls, anything that might explain the dog's behavior, but the land stayed quiet. Too quiet. His mind drifted toward the same questions that had bothered him since the first night. Was something out there? Was the dog tracking a scent Elias couldn't see? Was he missing a danger that he should have recognized sooner? He told himself to go back inside, to stop staring into darkness as if it would give him answers. But he stayed, gripping the railing, noticing how his breath came heavier than usual. Worry wasn't familiar to him. He didn't like feeling it now. Then the dog appeared. A shape moved near the edge of the pasture, slow, deliberate, and not alone. Elias tensed instantly, his hand drifting toward the revolver holstered at his hip, not out of aggression, but habit. When the dog stepped into the lantern glow, its tail low but wagging, Elias's shoulders loosened a fraction. Then he saw her. A woman stood behind the animal, one hand buried deep in its fur as if she were holding onto a lifeline. She looked thin, unsteady, and exhausted to the point where her legs shook even while standing still. Her deerskin dress was torn along the neckline, exposing a curved line of cleavage she kept struggling to hide by pressing a frayed blanket against her chest. The blanket slipped when she shifted her weight, revealing bruised skin along her collarbone before she could pull it back up. Elias felt his breath catch, not from desire but from the abrupt realization that she was hurt, frightened, and out of places to run. He stepped forward slowly, careful not to move too fast. She watched him with sharp, tense eyes, the kind of eyes that had been taught to expect danger before help. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Elias noticed how her breathing came in short bursts, how she kept her chin lifted even though she looked moments away from collapsing. She was young, mid-20s, maybe, and the strain on her face suggested she hadn't slept properly in days. His thoughts raced. Who chased her? Was she running from someone nearby? Was danger coming toward his home right now? Could he protect her if it did? She swallowed hard. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked at the edges but stayed steady enough to show she hadn't given up on herself yet. "I need shelter," she said quietly, each word pushed out as if weighed down by everything she had survived before reaching his yard. The dog pressed closer to her leg, glancing toward Elias as if urging him to decide quickly. Elias nodded once. Not dramatic, not hesitant, but firm. His thoughts were already moving through possibilities. If she was being hunted, if she needed medical help, if letting her in would put both of them at risk. Yet none of those concerns stopped him. Something in the way she stood, holding her torn dress together with a shaking hand, made the decision feel like the only reasonable choice. He stepped aside and opened the door, letting the warm lamplight spill onto the porch. It wasn't an invitation spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. She hesitated only a second, studying him, trying to judge if she was stepping into more danger. Then she walked past him with slow, measured steps, her body angled slightly away in case she needed to turn and run. The blanket slipped again, revealing the torn neckline and the soft curve beneath it before she pulled the fabric up sharply, her cheeks tightening with discomfort. She wasn't trying to seduce anyone. She was trying to protect herself. Inside, she stopped near the stove, gripping the table with trembling fingers as the warmth reached her. Elias saw dirt and dried blood along her arms, faint bruises scattered across her ribs, and a deep fatigue that threatened to drop her where she stood. He felt something in his chest twist, an old instinct to help, one he thought had dried out years ago. "Sit," he said quietly. She obeyed, her knees buckling more than she meant them to. She caught herself on the chair, breathing unevenly as the heat from the stove loosened the tightness in her limbs. Elias poured water into a tin cup and handed it to her. She took it with both hands, drinking slowly, eyes never leaving his face. He could see the stress behind her stare, the calculation, the fear, the attempt to understand his intentions while masking her own vulnerability. He didn't move closer. He didn't speak unless necessary. He understood too well what fear looked like when it was trying to stay dignified. Minutes passed in near silence. The dog curled beside her feet, acting as a barrier and reassurance at once. Elias gathered an old sewing kit from a drawer and sat at the table. He didn't touch her dress. He didn't ask her to show anything. Instead, he gently lifted the edge of her blanket and began stitching the torn corner of it, tightening the fabric so she wouldn't have to hold it against her body all night. She watched his hands move, her eyes softening just slightly. No one had done anything for her in a long time. He could see that realization settle over her. At one point, her head drooped forward from exhaustion. Elias reached out instinctively, lightly touching her shoulder to steady her. She startled, but didn't pull away. When she looked up, their faces were close, their breathing uneven from different reasons. Something quiet passed between them. Not desire yet, but recognition. Two people who had run out of places to go. He nodded toward the cot in the corner. "Rest. You're safe for tonight." She hesitated again, examining him with a level of scrutiny only someone recently hunted could possess. Then she stood, wrapping the blanket tight across her chest, and made her way to the cot. She didn't lie down immediately. She watched him for another silent moment, confirming he wasn't a threat. Only when she was certain did she lower herself carefully onto the mattress. Elias took the chair by the table, set his revolver within reach, and kept the lantern low. His eyes stayed open long after hers closed. He wasn't sure what he had invited into his home, but he knew he couldn't have turned her away. And that truth, simple and heavy, stayed with him as the cabin quieted. Morning pushed into the cabin slowly, the kind of pale light that didn't warm much but made the edges of objects clearer. Naya stirred before she fully woke, her breath catching when the blanket slipped down her shoulder. She grabbed it quickly, pulling it higher across her chest, checking if Elias was watching. He wasn't. He stood by the stove with his back turned, shifting a pan and adding wood with steady, controlled movements. Elias had been up for some time. The chair near the table was angled slightly, as if he had dozed sitting upright rather than lying down, though his eyes now looked sharp and alert. He kept glancing toward the window, checking for anything unusual in the yard. His mind was still turning over the same questions from last night. Whether someone had followed her, whether danger might be approaching, and what he would do if it did. Each possibility tightened something in his chest, but he hid it well. Naya sat up slowly, wincing as her ribs protested. Her hair fell forward, covering part of her face until she brushed it aside. The torn dress hung awkwardly from one shoulder, the neckline still damaged enough that she needed to tuck the blanket tight along the exposed curve of her chest. She checked Elias again, relieved that he still wasn't staring at her body or waiting for her to make a mistake. He finally spoke without turning. "Food's ready." His voice carried no judgment, no pressure. Just a simple statement meant to shorten the distance between them. She rose carefully, testing her first few steps. Her legs were stiff from exhaustion and cold, and she hid the tremble by gripping the cot frame until the feeling passed. When she walked toward the table, Elias stepped aside to give her more room. She noticed that. She noticed everything he didn't do as much as everything he did. She took the plate he set down and murmured, "Thank you." Her voice sounded steadier than last night, but still worn around the edges. Elias sat across from her. He didn't eat until she took her first bite, and she watched him from under lowered lashes. Trust didn't come easily to her, but she traced every piece of his behavior carefully. He didn't stare at her torn clothing. He didn't ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. He didn't stand too close. She exhaled through her nose, almost imperceptibly, and a thin thread of tension loosened from her shoulders. After breakfast, she rose to help clean up. When she reached for the water bucket, the blanket slipped again, exposing the neckline of her dress just enough for her to tense immediately. She pulled it tighter with a jerk, cheeks warming in embarrassment. The motion strained her ribs, and she stopped short, biting back a small sound. Elias stepped toward her and took the bucket from her hands before she could lift it. "You're hurt," he said quietly. "Rest." The firmness in his voice didn't carry authority, only concern. But concern was unfamiliar territory for her, and she straightened as if she needed to prove something. "I can work," she said. He watched her closely. She wasn't lying. It wasn't pride either. It was habit, the habit of someone who survived by being useful, by refusing to be a burden. He understood, too, well, how survival reshaped a person. He didn't push her away. He simply redirected her. "Here," he said, guiding her toward the chair near the stove. "Sit. Sort these." He placed a worn pile of kindling and frayed cloth beside her. Simple work she could manage without straining her injuries. She hesitated, then sat slowly. Accepting help cost her something, and Elias recognized the stiffness in her posture as she fought old instincts. While she worked, Elias went outside to check the yard. The morning air bit through his coat as he scanned the tree line, the empty pasture the prints left in the dirt. The dog trailed behind him, occasionally glancing toward the woods as if expecting someone or something to appear. Elias crouched down and inspected the tracks more closely. Nothing fresh, nothing to suggest immediate danger. But the worry lingered because fear wasn't always visible in the ground. Inside, Naya paused her sorting when she heard his boots returning to the porch. She watched the door until it opened, relief flickering across her face. It wasn't relief that he came back. It was relief that he came back calmly. No rush in his movements, no warning in his posture. A peaceful return was a good sign. He brushed off the cold and hung his coat near the door. She caught the faint tremor in his fingers before he steadied them. She wasn't the only one holding tension. "You check outside?" she asked quietly. "Yes." "Men." Her voice tightened around the word. No, he met her eyes. "Not today." The answer eased her breathing. She nodded once and returned to sorting the cloth, though her hands moved a little more smoothly now. Later, when he repaired a loose hinge on the door, she stood behind him with the blanket gathered tight across her chest. She observed the way he handled tools, the way his shoulders stayed relaxed, the way he didn't look back at her even when he knew she was there. She wasn't used to men who gave her space without expecting something for it. "You live here a long time?" she asked. "Long enough," he replied without turning. She studied him as he worked. His movements were controlled, deliberate, without wasted effort. He reminded her of someone who had learned to be alone because it was safer than depending on others. When he finished the hinge, he caught her watching him. She didn't look away fast enough. He saw the uncertainty in her eyes, uncertainty about him, about the future, about everything between last night and now. He saw the way her fingers tightened on the blanket, trying to keep her dress covered even though she knew she wasn't being watched the way she feared. "You're safe here," he said quietly. She held his gaze for a long second, searching his face for anything that didn't match the words. She found nothing. Her shoulders lowered slightly. For the first time since arriving, her voice softened. "Good." The dog nudged her hand. She allowed herself to pet it, her fingers sliding slowly along its fur. The animal leaned into her touch as if claiming her, and Elias watched the moment with a faint shift in his expression, something between recognition and acceptance. Afternoon passed with small tasks. She swept the floor in slow strokes that didn't strain her ribs. He repaired a crate. They spoke little, but the silence changed. It no longer felt like two strangers occupying the same space. It felt like a fragile truce forming into something steadier. As evening approached, she wrapped the blanket tighter and watched Elias from the table. He sharpened a knife slowly, his posture relaxed but alert. She studied the angle of his jaw, the way tension lived in tiny movements, the tightening of his grip, the careful way he breathed when he realized she was watching. She wasn't afraid of him. She was trying to understand him. Elias felt her gaze and glanced back. She didn't look away this time. Something in the room shifted. Small but unmistakable. He broke the gaze first, not out of discomfort but respect, returning to his work so she didn't feel exposed under his attention. Night settled, and she pulled the blanket close one last time before lying on the cot. She watched him extinguish the lantern, watched the way he folded his coat, watched the quiet care in every motion. She had never seen a man move like he expected someone to be watching with fear. She whispered, almost too quietly to hear, "Thank you, Elias." He didn't turn, but he heard it, and the sound settled deeper in him than he expected. The third morning arrived with a thin layer of frost clinging to the window frame, turning the light inside the cabin a dull gray. Naya woke slowly, lifting her head with a small wince as the soreness along her ribs reminded her she wasn't healed yet. She adjusted the blanket around her shoulders before sitting up, her movements careful. The torn dress still gaped at the neckline, the stitching she attempted last night too weak to hold under tension. Each time she shifted, the fabric loosened slightly, forcing her to clasp it with one hand while the other kept the blanket tight over her chest. Elias was already outside when she woke. Through the window, she saw him carrying a bucket toward the livestock trough, his breath clouding in the cold morning air. The dog trotted at his side, pausing to glance back at the cabin as if checking whether she was awake. Naya watched them quietly, her eyes following Elias's steady gait. Even from a distance, she sensed something restrained in his posture, like a man who did everything slowly to avoid stirring old memories. When he returned to the porch, Naya stood near the table with the blanket cinched under her arms. She tried not to look too self-conscious, but her hand kept drifting toward the torn part of her dress, adjusting, smoothing, covering. Elias noticed the gesture the moment he stepped inside, and he paused in the doorway, trying not to stare. She turned slightly away, pretending to study the stove, though she was aware of every second of his silence. "You slept any?" he asked, closing the door behind him with a soft thud. "A little," she answered, her voice rough from disuse. Her eyes met his briefly. She didn't smile, but some of the guarded tension she carried yesterday had softened. He sensed it and moved toward the stove to give her space. He poured water into a small pot and set it over the fire. "You hungry?" he asked. "Yes," she said, though she hesitated as if unsure she had the right to say it. Elias took a moment, reading that hesitation before nodding. "Sit. I'll fix something." Naya sat carefully, placing the blanket so that it draped across her front and hung low enough to conceal the torn neckline. She held her hands together on her lap, watching him move around the cabin. His steps were slow but firm, each action deliberate. The quiet between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was cautious but steadier than yesterday. When he placed a plate in front of her, she didn't pick it up right away. Instead, she studied his face, searching for any sign that she was unwelcome. She saw nothing but a calm patience she didn't fully trust yet, but wanted to. She ate with measured bites, stopping occasionally when the pain along her ribs flared. Elias noticed her breath catch once and asked, "Hurts worse today?" She shook her head. "No, just slow." He nodded and let her continue at her own pace. He respected the boundaries she wasn't even sure how to name. After breakfast, she stood and reached for the broom leaning against the wall. Elias moved to intercept her. "You don't need to do that," he said. "I want to," she replied. Her tone was soft but firm. He stepped back, letting her decide for herself. She swept the floor in long, even strokes, pausing only when the blanket slipped from her shoulder. She adjusted it with a quick tug, pulling the fabric higher to hide the line of exposed skin. The gesture was habitual now, protective, controlled, not panicked. Elias noticed each adjustment without letting his gaze linger. When she finished sweeping, she walked to the window and pushed the curtain aside, scanning the yard with narrowed eyes. Not fearful, watchful, checking the world for threats that once hunted her. "No sign of anyone," Elias said from behind her. She nodded but kept studying the tree line. Only when she leaned against the wall did her shoulders relax. Later in the afternoon, While Elias worked on clearing branches near the barn, Naya stepped outside, wearing only the blanket over her dress. The cold air tightened her skin, and she held the blanket close as she walked toward the chopping block. Elias looked up immediately. "You shouldn't be out long," he said, wiping his hands on his trousers. "I'm fine," she answered, though she stayed close to the cabin. He studied her posture, not defiant, not careless, just someone testing the edge of safety. She wasn't used to stillness. Survival had meant constant movement, and now that she could rest, her body didn't know what to do with the quiet. "You ever sew?" Elias asked, nodding toward the torn dress. She looked down, fingers brushing the weakened stitches. "A little. Not enough for this. I've got supplies inside," he said, "if you want them." Her eyebrows lifted in surprise. "You sew?" "A bit," he admitted, looking off to the side. Learned because no one else was around to fix things. She studied him again with that quiet, examining look she often used, a mix of curiosity and evaluation. She followed him inside, and he set an old wooden box on the table. She opened it slowly, tracing the spools of thread and needles with her fingertips as if they were unfamiliar luxuries. She tried stitching the neckline while Elias repaired a broken latch nearby. Her movements were slow and careful, but each pull of the thread made her wince, not from pain but frustration. The torn fabric refused to stay where she needed it. At one point, the blanket slipped down her shoulder again, revealing a deeper curve of skin as the dress loosened. She went still, embarrassed, tugging the blanket up with tense fingers. Elias paused his work without turning fully. "It's all right," he said quietly. "Take your time." She nodded, though her cheeks warmed. She pulled the blanket tighter and tried again. After several attempts, she sighed and set the needle down. "I can't fix it." Elias approached slowly. "Show me." She hesitated, gripping the blanket. Then she opened it just enough to expose the damaged section. No more than necessary, no less than required. He kept his gaze on the tear, not on her body, and she noticed that restraint immediately. "It's pulled too wide," he said. "The cloth's worn thin." She watched his hands as he examined the fabric. He didn't touch her skin. He didn't rush. He made sure she could see every movement before he made it. "I can try stitching it stronger," he said, "but it won't look new." "That's fine," she replied quietly. "I just don't want it to fall open." He nodded and went to work. She watched him in silence, her breathing gradually easing as the neckline came together under his careful threading. When he finished, the dress looked more secure, still low, but no longer unstable. She lifted the blanket and adjusted the dress with a slow inhale, testing the new seam. It held. "Better?" Elias asked. She nodded. "Yes." Their eyes met. Something unspoken passed between them, trust forming one stitch at a time. By dusk, the cabin felt warmer than before, not from the stove alone, but from the shift in how they moved around each other. Their steps were less cautious, their silences less sharp. When night finally settled across the yard, Elias checked the locks. Naya settled onto the cot, and the dog curled beside her, as if claiming her spot. Before she lay down, she looked toward Elias, her voice quiet but sure. Today felt different. Elias paused by the table. "Good different?" She considered the question, then nodded once. "Yes." He nodded back, a faint breath leaving him like something long held, easing for the first time. The lantern dimmed, and for the first time since arriving, Naya did not fall asleep tense. The weather shifted overnight. A cold front rolled down from the ridge, leaving a thin layer of mist clinging to the pines and flattening the sound of the land. When Elias stepped outside at first light, the air felt thick enough to quiet even his footsteps. He scanned the road, the tree line, the slope leading toward the creek. Nothing moved. No prints. No broken branches. The silence wasn't dangerous, but it held weight. Inside the cabin, Naya stood near the stove with the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She watched him through the window, her expression tight with something she hadn't said out loud, fear that the world outside was still hunting her. She caught sight of him looking back and straightened as if she didn't want him to see the tension she carried. When he re-entered the cabin, she asked, "Anyone there?" No, he answered. Not today. The answer didn't take all the worry from her face, but it eased something in her posture. She nodded and tightened the blanket across her chest where the repaired neckline of her dress still dipped lower than she preferred. Even repaired, the cloth lay loosely over the curve of her chest, forcing her to adjust it every time she moved. She held the edge now, not out of shame, but out of habit, a habit built from weeks of being watched by men with the wrong intentions. Elias noticed the small tug she gave the blanket, the stiff breath afterward. He didn't draw attention to it. Instead, he moved toward the table and began sorting tools he planned to take outside. You feeling stronger today? He asked. She closed the blanket a little more and stepped closer to him. I can walk better. Pain less. You should stay near the cabin, he said gently. Ground's icy. Don't want you slipping. She raised her chin slightly. I help. He studied her for a moment. Her determination wasn't stubbornness. It was the instinct of someone terrified of being useless. He understood that too well. All right, he said. Light work. Her shoulders eased, and she followed him outside. The yard still held patches of frost that crunched underfoot. Naya walked with careful steps, testing each place before she shifted her weight. She kept the blanket wrapped around her body, and the cold made her hold it tighter, hiding the neckline of her dress almost completely. Elias watched her from the corner of his eye, not in a way that made her self-conscious, but in a way that made sure she was steady on her feet. They reached the fence together. Elias crouched to check a weakened post while she stood close enough to see what he was doing. You check fence every day? She asked. Most days, he answered. Keeps cattle in. Keeps strangers out. She swallowed hard at the second part. When a cold wind pushed across the field, she stepped closer without thinking, her shoulder brushing his arm. The contact made her freeze for half a second, unsure if she'd cross a line, but Elias didn't move away. He continued working, though he adjusted his stance slightly to give her more space to stand without losing warmth. That small allowance softened something in her. She stayed close until he finished securing the post. When he stood, she followed him back toward the cabin, aware of the dog trailing behind them with an easy, loyal stride. The dog nudged her leg once, and Naya's lips tightened in what might have been the beginning of a smile. The gesture surprised her as much as it surprised Elias. Inside, the warmth hit her face, and she loosened the blanket a little. The neckline of her dress shifted again, exposing a curved line of skin before she tugged the blanket up sharply. She exhaled with quiet frustration. Elias noticed her discomfort and set down his tools. I've got leather strips. Might help reinforce the stitching. She hesitated. You fix again? I can try. She weighed the offer carefully, then nodded once. Elias prepared the table with thread and leather pieces while Naya sat across from him. She pulled the blanket aside, just enough to expose the torn section. Her movements were slow, intentional. She kept control over what he could see, and he respected that boundary without question. He stitched the leather backing into the fabric with deliberate care. She watched him the entire time, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the blanket. Every so often, her gaze lifted to his face as if she were studying not just his actions, but what kind of man he was. Your hand's very steady, she said quietly. Used to repairing gear, he replied, and working with horses. Needs steadiness for both. She nodded thoughtfully. Many men rush. Break more things. Elias looked up just enough to meet her eyes. I don't rush things I care about. The words caught them both off guard. Elias looked back down immediately, focusing on the next stitch as if the sentence had escaped him unintentionally. Naya's expression changed, softer, almost vulnerable, but she didn't comment on it. When he finished, the dress had more structure. The neckline still dipped lower than a new garment would, but it no longer threatened to fall open. She tested it gently, letting the blanket fall back a few inches to see how it sat. The repaired fabric framed the upper curve of her cleavage more securely now, and though it revealed skin, it did so in a way that felt controlled. She breathed out slowly. Better. Elias nodded. You won't have to fight with it all day. The dog barked once outside the door, shaking the moment apart. Elias stood to check the yard. Nea followed him instinctively, but he held up a hand in a small gesture. "Stay here. It's fine." She obeyed, though her fingers clutched the blanket again. Elias stepped out, scanned the yard, and returned a minute later. "Just a rabbit," he said. Nea let out a breath she'd been holding. Later in the afternoon, she helped him fold blankets and store supplies. The closeness between them had shifted, quietly, naturally. At one point, as they lifted a crate together, her hand slipped and brushed firmly against his wrist. She felt the warmth of his skin through the contact. Instead of pulling away, she left her hand there a heartbeat longer, testing his reaction. Elias didn't move, didn't tense, didn't take advantage. He simply waited until she shifted her grip again. That patience anchored her more than anything. By evening, the cabin felt different. The routine of the day had formed a small bond neither of them said aloud. There were still silences, but they held lighter edges now. When she lay down on the cot, she looked toward Elias, who was checking the lantern wick. "You always live alone?" she asked. "Mostly. You want that?" He paused at the question, the quiet stretching just long enough to show it hit him somewhere he didn't expect. "No," he said finally. "Not always." She absorbed that answer, her eyes steady on him. Then she pulled the blanket over her shoulder, settled against the cot, and let her breath ease out. For the first time since arriving, she didn't fall asleep watching the door. She fell asleep watching him. A heavy gray sky settled over the valley by the time morning reached the cabin. The air felt dense enough to slow every sound, and a thin chill crawled through the cracks of the old wood. Elias added more logs to the stove before Nea woke, careful not to let the door bang shut. The warmth spread slowly, but the cabin still held the kind of cold that made breath linger in front of one's face. Nea stirred under the blanket, blinking through sleep before pushing herself upright with a faint groan. Her ribs weren't as swollen as before, but the soreness still made her sit in sections. First her elbows, then her shoulders, finally her back straightening against the wall. The repaired neckline of her dress held steady, though the fabric still dipped low enough that she adjusted it once before standing. Her eyes drifted to Elias, who was tying a rope around a bundle of wood. He didn't turn, but he knew she was watching. "Cold morning," he said, voice rough from sleep. She wrapped the blanket tighter across her front. "Feels heavier today. It'll warm after midday," he replied. "Storm moved out." She nodded, though she didn't fully understand weather patterns here. She studied the way Elias's movement stayed, even controlled. He worked like a man who measured every step, not out of fear, but out of discipline carved into him long before she arrived. He set the wood aside and glanced toward her. "You hungry?" She hesitated. "Yes." He motioned for her to sit. She did, the blanket still clutched with her left hand. He moved around the stove, preparing what little they had without fuss: pan bread, leftover potatoes, a bit of dried meat softened in warm water. The motions were simple but deliberate, and she watched with a quiet curiosity she didn't bother hiding. When he placed the plate in front of her, she murmured her thanks, then ate with slow, careful bites. Elias sat across from her, not eating until she did. She noticed that again. Halfway through the meal, a sudden gust pushed against the window, rattling the frame. She tensed instantly, her hand tightening around the blanket until her knuckles whitened. Elias saw the shift and paused his own movement. "Just wind," he said calmly. She tried to steady her breathing. Sounded different. He tilted his head slightly, listening. Then he nodded. Nothing out there but cold. Her shoulders eased by small degrees. She returned to her food, though she checked the window once more before finishing the meal. After breakfast, Nea stood and took a few steps toward the door. Elias noticed immediately. "You planning to go outside?" he asked. "Yes," she said, though she remained near the threshold. "I want air." "You should stay close," he cautioned. "I will." She stepped out onto the porch, inhaling deeply. The cold bit into her cheeks, but it felt clean and sharp rather than threatening. The trees stood still, their dark silhouettes rising through the mist. She scanned the area with a practiced eye, checking for movement, signs of tracks, anything out of place. When she saw none, she let out a breath she didn't know she held. Elias walked up beside her, stopping at a comfortable distance. "You're getting steadier," he said. "Feels different," she replied. "Better or worse?" She thought about it seriously. "Better. I don't feel chased when I breathe here." He nodded, but the quiet emotion in her answer settled somewhere deep inside him. He wasn't sure what to say, so he didn't force words. They walked toward the barn together, the dog weaving between them as if trying to herd them into a single line. Naya's steps were slower than Elias's, but she didn't lean on anything for support. She carried herself with deliberate caution, learning the ground beneath her feet the way she once learned danger. At the barn, Elias inspected a cracked board while Naya stood behind him, pulling the blanket closer around her body. The neckline of her dress dipped again with the movement, but she adjusted it quickly. Elias noticed, but he didn't stare. "You cold?" he asked quietly. "A little." He paused his work, unbuttoned his coat, and draped it over her shoulders with a steady, slow motion meant not to startle her. The weight surprised her, as did the warmth trapped inside the fabric from his own body heat. She looked up at him, her dark eyes caught between gratitude and confusion. "You need it more," she said softly. "I got layers," he replied. Her fingers tightened around the coat edges. "Thank you." Back inside, she stood near the stove thawing out while Elias set tools on the table. She watched him for several moments, then approached slowly. "I want to help," she said. "You already do." "I mean real help," she clarified. "Not just sorting things." He studied her expression. The uncertainty was gone. She wanted purpose. He understood that need too well. "All right," he said. "Come here." He handed her a wooden crate filled with metal hooks for the barn doors. They weren't heavy, but they needed sorting and checking for rust. She sat at the table, pulling one hook after another from the crate and tapping them lightly to test their strength. Her concentration was intense, her brows pulled together, the blanket slipping down her arm as she worked. When it exposed more of her dress, she raised it again without breaking her focus. Elias watched the movement, recognizing it now as a familiar pattern. Adjust, continue, breathe. Hours passed quietly. The tension that once filled the spaces between them had thinned, replaced by something calmer, something like cooperation. At midday, when she leaned forward to reach the far edge of the table, the repaired neckline shifted, revealing more skin than she expected. She froze for a second, instinctively reaching for the blanket. Elias, noticing her discomfort, turned away and picked up a tool near the stove. "It's fine," he said quietly. "No reason to feel embarrassed." She blinked, surprised by the gentleness of his tone. "In my settlement, men don't look away." "I'm not them," he replied simply. The words hit her harder than she anticipated. Later, while Elias chopped firewood outside, Naya ventured out again. She stood a few feet from him, holding a basket of kindling she collected from around the yard. She watched each swing of the axe, the way his muscles strained beneath his shirt, the way his jaw locked when he focused. When he paused to wipe his brow, she stepped closer. "You work hard. Work keeps the place standing," he said. She looked down at the basket she held. "I want to help keep it standing, too." He met her eyes. She wasn't offering charity. She was offering commitment. "Then stay close," he said. "We'll find more things you can do." A faint breath left her, relief mingling with something warmer. That evening, while preparing supper, Naya accidentally knocked over a small jar near the stove. It clattered loudly, and she jumped back in fear before she could stop herself. Elias turned immediately, hands steady, eyes calm. "Naya," he said gently, "just a jar." She swallowed hard. "I know. My body doesn't know." "It will," he said. "Give it time." She nodded, ashamed of her reaction, but grateful he didn't make it bigger than it was. When they sat to eat, she pulled his coat tighter around herself and looked at him with a new steadiness. "Today, I didn't feel alone," she said quietly. Elias paused with his fork half raised, absorbing her words. "You're not," he answered. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't heavy. It was just true. She lowered her gaze but smiled. Small, controlled, real. And as the stove crackled softly behind them, the distance between their lives narrowed one more step, not from passion, not from fear, but from a simple, growing certainty. They were beginning to belong to the same place. The next morning brought a break in the weather. The mist had lifted, leaving the sky a pale, washed-out blue. A thin breeze moved across the yard, not warm but gentler than before. Elias stood outside early, feeling the change in the air as he checked the trough and the fence line. His movements were steady, familiar, but his thoughts weren't. He kept replaying the way Naya had spoken last night, the quiet confession that she hadn't felt alone. He wasn't sure what it meant for her or for him, but the words kept returning, settling deeper than he expected. Inside the cabin, Naya folded Elias's coat neatly before placing it on a chair. She hesitated before letting it go, fingers lingering on the edge of the sleeve. His scent still clung to the fabric, wood smoke, sweat, and the cold morning air. She pulled her hand away quickly, adjusting her blanket as if she had made too bold a gesture even when she was alone. She brushed her hair back with slow motions, her ribs sore but manageable now. The dress Elias had reinforced sat more securely, though it still dipped low along her chest. She tugged the neckline up gently, checking that the new stitching held. It did. She let out a soft breath, relief mixed with something she didn't know how to name. The door opened, and Elias stepped in. He paused when he saw her standing in the morning light, the blanket draped across her shoulders, but not fully hiding the shape of her body. She looked stronger today, not physically, though she moved with more confidence, but in the way she stood without bracing herself for threat. "Morning," he said, setting his hat on a hook. "Morning," she answered. There was a softness in her voice he hadn't heard before. After a simple breakfast, they fell into a rhythm neither had planned. Elias cleaned the oil lamp while Naya swept the floor, her movements smoother than in previous days. She didn't startle at every sound now. She didn't check the windows every few minutes. She still held the blanket close when her dress shifted, but the gesture no longer looked desperate, just cautious. When she finished sweeping, she approached Elias with a question that made him stop completely. "Can you teach me work here?" "Real work." He looked at her. "What kind?" "Anything," she said. "I want to know how to stay, how to help, how to belong." The last word came out quietly, almost reluctant. She watched him carefully, waiting for his reaction. Elias didn't answer right away. He saw the seriousness in her eyes, the way her fingers gripped the blanket near her collarbone, the uncertainty just under her voice. He nodded finally. "All right, I'll show you what I can." A faint breath left her, part tension, part gratitude. They started outside. The ground was still cold, but manageable. Elias led her to the woodpile, explaining how to sort logs by dryness. Naya listened intently, asking short questions, repeating instructions back to make sure she understood. When she tried lifting a larger log, she winced and set it down. "Don't push it," Elias said. "You're still healing." She nodded, though frustration flickered across her face. She wanted strength she didn't yet have. Elias saw it and picked up a smaller log, setting it before her. "Start with these." She accepted the change without argument. Her pride was strong, but her willingness to listen was stronger. As she worked, the blanket slipped off her shoulder again. This time she didn't freeze or turn away. She adjusted it calmly, covering the neckline before continuing. Elias noticed but didn't comment. His silence, respectful and steady, felt like protection rather than avoidance. After sorting wood, they checked the feed barrels. Naya lifted the lid and peered inside, her hair falling forward. Elias stepped beside her, explaining how much grain to measure for the animals. She listened closely, their shoulders almost touching. At one point, Naya's hand brushed Elias's while both reached for the same scoop. She pulled back immediately, then hesitated, her eyes darting up to his face for a reaction. Elias didn't move away. "You're all right," he said quietly. Her shoulders softened. She left her hand near his this time. Back in the cabin, Naya prepared herbs while Elias repaired a loose board near the floor. She worked with focus, crushing dried leaves with the back of a spoon. The action steadied her, gave her purpose she hadn't felt in weeks. Every so often she glanced at Elias, studying the lines of his face, the way he concentrated, the controlled way he breathed. Her pulse quickened without her understanding why. When her ribs ached, she stopped for a moment, pressing a hand against her side. Elias looked over instantly, his expression concerned. "You all right?" "Just tired," she admitted. He stood and approached her slowly. "Sit down. I'll finish." She allowed him to guide her to the chair. His hand didn't linger, but the warmth of his touch stayed with her. She sat with the blanket around her shoulders, watching him kneel to gather the rest of the herbs. Something settled inside her at the sight. Something quiet, steady, unfamiliar. She spoke without thinking. "You treat people gentle." Elias paused. "Only way I know. Not every man is gentle," she said. "I know." His voice tightened at the edges. She recognized the shift, pain tucked beneath a calm surface. She didn't press further. As evening approached, the cabin filled with a soft orange glow from the stove. Naya moved around more easily now, setting plates on the table while Elias poured water into a kettle. Their movements crossed naturally, without the awkwardness of earlier days. They brushed arms once, and Naya didn't pull back. Neither did Elias. After supper, they sat near the fire. Naya leaned forward, warming her hands, the repaired neckline of her dress falling slightly as she shifted. Elias noticed the way she adjusted it, then noticed how she glanced toward him afterward. Not fearful, but checking. She spoke first. "Today felt steady." "You did good," he said. She looked into the fire, her voice low. "I don't feel hunted here. Not when you're close." Elias exhaled slowly. The words weren't romantic, but they carried weight. Weight he understood too well. "You're safe," he said. "I'll make sure of it." She turned to him, her expression open in a way he hadn't seen before. "I believe you." The room felt different after that. Warmer, quieter, filled with something unspoken but unmistakable. When she lay down on the cot later, she paused before pulling the blanket over herself. "Elias," she said softly. "Yeah, I want tomorrow to be like today." He nodded once. "We can make it that way." She settled under the covers, her breathing slow and calm. Elias sat at the table for a long moment before extinguishing the lantern, feeling the shift between them settle in the air, like a promise neither had said aloud. Tomorrow would be different, better, closer. The sun rose slower than usual the next morning, climbing through a thin bank of clouds that left the light pale and cold across the yard. Elias stepped outside with his coat half-buttoned, listening for anything unusual before committing to the day. The dog was already sniffing near the fence, tail moving in a slow rhythm that signaled calm. Elias let his breath settle. Nothing stirred beyond the tree lean. No tracks, no signs of approach. Inside the cabin, Naya stood near the stove, warming her hands, her hair loose down her back and her blanket pulled around her shoulders. The repaired dress rested more securely today. The stitches Elias added had held through the night, though the neckline still dipped low enough that she kept the blanket close. She looked stronger, her posture more open, the stiffness in her movements eased. When Elias came back in, she glanced toward him with a look that carried recognition, not fear. "Everything quiet?" she asked. "Quiet," he confirmed. "Nothing out there." A soft exhale left her, the kind that loosened her face and dropped her shoulders an inch. She didn't hide it this time. After breakfast, Elias pulled a small crate from under the bed, old tools, and used nails, leather scraps, odds and ends he hadn't organized in months. He meant to sort it alone, but when he placed it on the floor, Naya was already kneeling beside him. "I help," she said. He didn't argue. He passed her a handful of pieces to separate. She worked with careful, deliberate motions, the blanket slipping down enough to expose the upper edge of her chest. She adjusted it calmly, not rushed, as if she finally understood she didn't need to fear his eyes. Elias noticed the shift, not in her dress, but in the way she carried herself. "You're moving better," he said without looking directly at her. "My ribs hurt less," she replied. Breathing easier now, he nodded and continued sorting. The dog approached and rested its head against Naya's knee. She smiled faintly, her first clear smile since she arrived, and brushed her fingers gently behind its ear. Elias caught the expression from the corner of his eye. It was small, brief, but it settled something steady in his chest. Later in the morning, Elias took her outside to show her how to check the barn latch. The wind carried a cold bite, but not enough to keep them inside. Nea wrapped the blanket tight around her waist and stepped onto the porch with him. The yard felt wider today, not because it had changed, but because she walked across it with less hesitation. She looked around as she moved, but not with the sharp alertness of someone running. More like someone relearning a world she hadn't been allowed to stand still in. Elias explained how the latch worked, how to test the hinges, how to spot rust. She listened closely, repeating the steps with her own hands. When she leaned forward, the blanket shifted, revealing the repaired neckline of her dress. Still low, still showing a curved line of skin. She adjusted it with her fingertips, but she didn't turn away from Elias. She didn't hide. "You learning fast," he said. She glanced at him. "You teach clear." Something warm flickered between them, unspoken but real. Elias felt it settle behind his ribs like a weight he didn't mind carrying. Inside, around midday, Nea sat on the chair with her legs tucked under the blanket while Elias worked on reshaping a bent horseshoe. The hammering echoed softly through the room. She watched him, studying the concentration in his face, the steady way he breathed between strikes. "Elias," she said quietly. He set the hammer down and looked at her. She hesitated, struggling to form the thought she had been holding since dawn. "You never asked me to leave." "No," he answered plainly. "Why not?" He didn't speak immediately. He wiped his hands on a cloth, thinking through his answer instead of giving the first easy thing that came to mind. "You were hurt. Alone. Scared," he said. "A decent man wouldn't send someone out like that." "But now," she said, voice lower, "I'm better. You still let me stay." He met her eyes, steady and calm. "Because you seem like you want to." She drew in a breath, her fingers tightening around the blanket. She wasn't used to choices, real ones. Not in recent years. "I do," she said. Her words were simple, but the quiet conviction behind them filled the room. In the afternoon, while Elias repaired a loose plank on the porch, Nea approached him holding a small bundle of herbs she had dried. She knelt beside him, her knees brushing his coat where it hung over her shoulders. "These help with pain," she said. "For your hands." He glanced down at his knuckles, scraped from work. "You don't have to fix me too." "I want to," she replied softly. She took his hand carefully, her fingertips warm against his skin. She rubbed the herbs between her palms and pressed the mixture over the raw spots. Elias watched her work, slow, focused, gentle. Her touch brought no tension, only a quiet sense of being seen. When she finished, she didn't pull away immediately. Neither did he. She left her hand, covering his a moment longer, testing the ground between them. He didn't move. That was enough. Toward evening, the wind died completely, leaving the world outside still. Elias set aside the tools for the day, and Nea swept the last of the wood shavings from the floor. When she straightened, her eyes found his, calm and searching. "Today felt new," she said carefully. "How so?" She walked toward him, steps steady, blanket sliding slightly down her arm. The neckline dipped again, but she didn't fix it right away. She stood close, close enough that he felt her breath against his shirt. "I'm not afraid here," she said. "Not of you. Not of outside. Not of being seen." Elias felt the weight of those words settle deep. He turned slightly toward her, giving her space to step back if she wanted. She didn't move. Instead, she lifted her hand slowly and placed it against his chest, light, testing, wanting to see his reaction. Her fingers pressed through the fabric, and she felt his breath shift under her touch. He didn't step away. Her voice dropped to a quiet murmur. "I want to stay close to you." Elias swallowed once, not from fear, but from the seriousness in her tone. "You can," he said, "as close as you want." She swallowed, eyes softening. Then she leaned in, her forehead resting lightly against his chest. He brought his hand to her back, not pulling, just resting, a solid presence she could choose to lean into. She stayed there a long time. When she finally stepped away, her cheeks were warm, her breathing steady, her eyes clearer than he had ever seen them. "I feel safe," she whispered. "You are," he answered. That night, when she lay on the cot, she didn't turn toward the wall. She turned toward him. And for the first time, she fell asleep with her hand resting near where his arm hung over the table, close enough to touch if she needed to. The weather warmed just enough the next morning to soften the frost along the porch rails. A thin band of sunlight cut through the clouds, landing across the yard in a muted strip of gold. Elias stepped outside first, boots crunching softly in the damp soil. He scanned the tree line, eyes narrowing out of habit, but the land sat still, quiet enough to ease the pressure in his chest. Inside, Nea folded the blanket she had slept with, smoothing the corners before laying it at the foot of the cot. Her movements were slow, not because of pain, but because she was thinking, her mind drifting toward things she hadn't allowed herself to imagine in a long time. Each thought carried the weight of choice, not survival. She paused, adjusting the neckline of her dress where the leather reinforcement held it firm, but still low, outlining a soft curve she no longer hid with panic. She covered it with her hand only long enough to secure the blanket around her shoulders. Elias returned, brushing cold air from his coat. When he saw her standing near the window, her hair loose and long down her back, he stopped without meaning to. She turned when she sensed him watching, her expression open, no longer guarded. "Anything outside?" she asked. "No trouble," he replied. "Just quiet." A faint, relieved breath left her, and Elias felt something inside him settle. Not because she depended on him, but because she trusted him enough to ask. After breakfast, they stepped out together to the yard. The dog trotted ahead, circling back every few steps as if herding them closer. Nea walked beside Elias with a steadiness that looked different from previous days, more grounded, more assured of her place here. She didn't cling to the blanket as tightly now. Instead, she let it hang over her elbows at times, exposing her dress in a way she controlled rather than feared. Elias guided her toward the far fence, pointing out a warped beam that needed reinforcing. She listened quietly, watching the way he assessed the wood, checking for moisture and rot. When he handed her a nail to examine, she turned it in her fingers, the cold metal warming slowly in her palm. "You're learning," he said. She lifted her chin a little. "You teach good." A ghost of a smile tugged at Elias's mouth, not fully formed, but real. She saw it and felt a soft heat spread across her chest, not from embarrassment, but from the recognition that she could affect him. He stepped closer to demonstrate how to angle the nail. When his hand brushed hers, she didn't pull away. Instead, her breath caught for a brief, small moment, barely noticeable unless someone stood very near. Elias noticed. He didn't move his hand. By midday, the warming air encouraged them to walk farther from the cabin. Nea moved with growing confidence, stepping over fallen branches and testing the ground with her toes before committing her weight. Elias walked beside her, not leading and not following, simply matching her pace. They stopped near the clearing where the sun broke through the pines. Nea closed her eyes and lifted her face toward the light, letting the warmth touch her skin. Elias watched her in the quiet, taking in the calm that had replaced the fear she carried when she first appeared at his fence line. "You look different today," he said quietly. She opened her eyes, searching his expression. "Different how?" "Less guarded. More yourself." She inhaled slowly, considering his words. "I feel like I can breathe here." He nodded. "You can." She stepped a little closer, her blanket slipping behind her elbows. The neckline of her dress dipped lightly with the movement, the leather stitching holding firm. She saw his eyes flicker briefly to the shape revealed there, and instead of turning away, she held still, watching his reaction. He didn't stare. He didn't flinch. He didn't pretend he hadn't looked. He met her gaze with quiet honesty. That was enough for her. Later, back at the cabin, Nea sorted herbs while Elias sharpened a knife near the window. She ground dried leaves with steady force, pausing occasionally to glance in his direction. Each time he looked up, she looked a fraction longer before returning to her work. When she finished separating the herbs, she approached him slowly, holding out a small cloth packet. "For your hands," she said. "Use this when the skin cracks." Elias accepted it, brushing her fingers in the process. She didn't move her hand right away. Instead, She let the touch linger, her eyes lowering as she felt the warmth travel up her arm. He glanced down at their touching hands, then back up at her face. "You sure?" he asked softly. She nodded once. "Yes." The room tightened in a quiet, steady way. Nothing rushed, nothing forced. She stepped closer, closing the remaining distance until her breath warmed the front of his shirt. Her hand slid from his to his forearm, testing whether he'd pull away. He didn't. He stood still, his breathing slow but deeper now. Nea lifted her face to his, hesitant but certain. Elias didn't move first. He waited, giving her control, giving her choice. She rose onto her toes, slightly, her fingers curling around his arm for balance, and pressed her lips to his, soft, warm, deliberate. A kiss without urgency, shaped by gratitude, fear letting go, and new trust taking its place. Elias returned the kiss with equal restraint, his hand resting lightly on her waist, not pulling her closer, just letting her know he was there. When she eased back, her breathing trembled, not from fear, but from the intensity of feeling something she hadn't expected to feel again. "I wanted to do that," she whispered. "I know," he replied quietly. "And you didn't stop me." "No," he said, his voice steady. "I didn't want to." A faint shiver ran through her body, not from cold, but from the shift that had just happened. They spent the afternoon in quiet work. She moved near him more often, brushing his shoulder when passing, placing tools closer to his hand, choosing to stand beside him instead of across the room. He accepted every small gesture without pushing her for more. As evening settled, Elias pulled the last shutter closed. Nea stood behind him, her toes almost touching his heels. "Elias," she said softly. He turned. She lifted her hand and placed it on his chest again, like she had the night before, but this time her touch didn't hesitate. "Today," she said, swallowing lightly, "I didn't feel alone at all." He covered her hand with his own, warm and steady. "You're not," he said. Her eyes softened, the blanket slipping slightly as she leaned closer. "Good," she whispered. "I want this." Elias felt the truth in her voice. Not desperation, not fear, choice. She stepped even closer, letting her forehead rest against his chest, her breath slow and certain. He lowered his head enough that his cheek brushed the top of her hair. And in that simple contact, something settled permanently between them. Not spoken, not defined, but unmistakable. A pull neither of them intended, but neither wished to stop. They stood like that until the last light faded. The morning arrived quiet and bright, the kind of soft brightness that meant spring was near. Thin strips of sunlight slid across the cabin walls, warming the floorboards and reaching the edge of the cot, where Nea was already awake. She sat with her knees drawn under the blanket, watching Elias move around the small kitchen area as he prepared coffee. Her expression was steady, calm in a way that belonged to someone who no longer feared the next hour. The repaired neckline of her dress sat low but secure, revealing a gentle curve she no longer scrambled to cover. She adjusted it only once, out of habit rather than necessity. When she stood, the blanket slipped from her shoulders, and she didn't rush to catch it. She simply folded it over the cot as if it finally belonged to a peaceful morning instead of a night of survival. Elias noticed a change. He watched her for a moment, the light reflecting off the quiet confidence she carried now. He didn't speak right away because the shift was clear enough without words. "Sleep all right?" he asked at last. She nodded, stepping closer. "I did. I feel settled." "Good," he said, and something softened around his eyes. She touched his arm gently, her fingertips brushing along the inside of his elbow, an intimate gesture she would never have allowed on her first night here. His muscles relaxed under her touch, and she drew in a breath as if committing the moment to memory. After breakfast, they walked outside together. The air held a faint chill, but patches of thawed earth were visible beneath the frost. The dog trotted ahead, stopping every few feet to look back at them. The yard felt like a shared space now, not his and not hers, but theirs. Nea walked without the blanket today, her dress reinforced enough to stay in place, her posture straight. She scanned the distant brush out of habit, but the tension that once tightened her shoulders was gone. Elias watched her expression carefully, realizing she was no longer searching for danger. She was simply taking in the land. You planning to stay close when we go back in? Elias asked, her head turned toward him. If you want me to. He didn't hesitate. I do. She stepped closer, her hand sliding into his without warning. It was the boldest thing she'd done yet. Elias tightened his fingers around hers quietly, a simple confirmation that steadied something deep inside her. They checked the fence for the last time that season. Naya carried the nails without Elias needing to ask. When he needed the hammer, she handed it to him before he even reached for it. Their movements matched in a way that felt practiced, though they had only worked together for a handful of days. At one point, when Elias shifted to the next post, Naya stepped forward to steady the wood. The wind pushed against her, making her lose footing for a moment. Elias reached out, catching her waist firmly. She steadied herself with one hand pressed flat against his chest, her thumb brushing his shirt. You all right? He asked. Yes, she breathed, but she didn't move her hand. He didn't either. Their eyes held for several long seconds. Everything between them felt settled, not fragile. She lowered her hand only when she chose to. Back inside, the fire warmed the cabin fully. Naya stood near the stove preparing herbs while Elias arranged a stack of tools. The quiet felt different today, full instead of empty, calm instead of tense. She watched him across the room, noticing how his shoulders relaxed more now, how he didn't carry himself with the same solitary heaviness he had before she arrived. Elias, she said, walking toward him. Can I say something? He looked up and nodded. Anything. She stood in front of him, fingertips tracing the edge of the table as she gathered her thoughts. Her dress shifted slightly, and she didn't bother adjusting it this time. When I came here, I didn't know if I would live another night. I know, he said quietly. You didn't ask who I was running from, she continued. You didn't try to take anything from me. You just kept me warm, fed me, let me sleep. No man has ever done that without wanting something. Elias's jaw tightened slightly. I didn't want anything. I know, she said, stepping closer. That's why I stayed. His breath caught. Not dramatically, just enough that she noticed. She reached out and took his hand, lifting it to rest against her waist. I want to stay, she said softly. Not because I'm scared, not because I need shelter, but because when you're near me, I don't feel alone anymore. He exhaled, slow and deliberate, as if releasing years of quiet he hadn't realized he was carrying. I want that too, he said. She stepped closer, their bodies inches apart. Then, let me belong here. With you. You already do, he answered, touching her face gently. She leaned into his palm, her breath warm against his wrist. The kiss that followed was slower than the first, deeper, more deliberate. She pressed her hands to his chest, pulling herself against him. Elias's arms circled her waist carefully, holding her without pressure, giving her full control even as he returned the kiss. When she broke the kiss, she rested her forehead against his shoulder and whispered, I'm choosing you, not running to you. Elias closed his eyes at that, letting the truth settle. And I'm choosing you, he said. There was no hesitation in his voice. As the sun lowered behind the ridge, they stood side by side on the porch, looking over the land that had brought them together. Naya leaned into Elias, her cheek resting on his upper arm, the dog lying at their feet. The wind was gentle now, carrying the scent of thawing earth. What happens now? She asked quietly. We make a life, he said, if you want that. She nodded slowly. With you. Yes. Elias looked down at her, his hand sliding around the small of her back. Then this is home. For both of us. A peaceful silence settled between them, real, grounded, earned. Naya closed her eyes for a moment, letting the truth sink in. She had arrived here broken, hunted, afraid to breathe. Now she stood on the same porch with a man who steadied her with nothing more than quiet presence. She wasn't alone. She wasn't running. She wasn't surviving. She was home. Elias pressed a light kiss to her temple. She turned toward him with a calm smile. And in that small, sure moment, their future formed, clear, warm, and without a single question left hanging. They stayed together